So, Iowa farmers found out about the deal from a Chinese customs bulletin before their own trade office called them back. China just quietly opened its market to Canadian soybeans at scale in the middle of the exact season American growers were counting on Beijing to buy from them instead. Soybean futures moved within hours of the filing hitting trade desks. Farm state senators started making calls before lunch. And according to people who track the Chinese Ministry of Commerce's procurement signals for a living, this wasn't a one-off purchase order. It was the outline of a multi-year sourcing shift, the kind of arrangement that doesn't get undone the next time trade relations happen to improve. Warren Buffett, who has spent decades watching commodity markets get reshaped by exactly this kind of quiet substitution, put it in a single line that farm broadcasters have been replaying ever since. You don't lose a customer in a phone call, Warren Buffett said. You lose them in the 18 months before it, while you're busy assuming they have nowhere else to go. When you hear how long China had actually been building this alternative, and what American growers were told right up until the week it became public, you'll understand why agricultural economists are calling this the most consequential shift in North American soybean trade since China first became the industry's largest buyer. Hit subscribe because this story is still moving, and the next planting season is going to look nothing like the ones American farmers have built their operations around for 20 years. Let me give you the full context, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. China has been the single largest export market for American soybeans for the better part of 2 decades, a relationship so foundational to Farm Belt economics that entire counties across Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, and the Dakotas built their planting decisions, their equipment financing, their land values, around the assumption that Chinese demand would always be there in the fall. That assumption survived the first trade war, the one that began back in 2018, though it left scars. It survived because, at the time, China genuinely didn't have a fast alternative. Brazilian production wasn't yet large enough to fully replace American volume, and Canadian soybean acreage, while established, had never been positioned as a serious substitute at the scale China actually needed. That calculus started changing years before this deal became public, and most Americans don't realize how early the shift began. China's own trade planners, according to people who track Beijing's agricultural procurement strategy, treated the 2018 to 2020 trade war as a permanent lesson rather than a temporary disruption. The strategic conclusion drawn inside Chinese commerce ministries wasn't that the tariff dispute would eventually resolve and normal buying patterns would return. It was that dependence on any single American administration's trade posture was a vulnerability that needed to be engineered out of the system entirely, regardless of who occupied the White House in any given cycle. Brazil absorbed the largest share of that diversification effort over the following years, and its soybean export capacity roughly doubled in the years that followed as Chinese buyers and Brazilian growers built out new port infrastructure specifically to handle the volume. But Brazil alone couldn't cover the full diversification China wanted. A second, smaller track of outreach quietly began with Canadian growers and Canadian trade officials, positioning Canadian soybean acreage as a supplementary, lower volume, but strategically valuable third leg of supply, one that could be scaled up quickly if political circumstances made scaling it up advantageous. Contrast how each side approached this period, because it explains everything that followed. Chinese agricultural procurement officials, according to trade analysts who track their public and private engagements, spent years cultivating relationships with Canadian grain handlers, port authorities in Vancouver and Thunder Bay, and provincial agriculture ministries, building the logistics and quality certification relationships needed to scale Canadian soybean exports on short notice if the moment ever called for it. None of this generated headlines. It was the unglamorous, methodical work of building an option nobody was yet using. Meanwhile, American agricultural trade policy toward China during the same years, according to multiple farm state trade advocates, focused almost entirely on securing purchase commitments and resolving the immediate tariff dispute, treating China's demand for American soybeans as a structural certainty that didn't require active cultivation, because it had simply always been there. The tipping point, according to people familiar with the timeline inside China's Commerce Ministry, arrived when tariff tensions escalated again in 2025, layered on top of unrelated diplomatic friction over technology export controls and shipping restrictions. For Chinese trade planners, that was the moment when the years-long hedge against American soybean dependency stopped being a contingency plan and became an active procurement strategy. Something had to give, and Beijing decided that the political cost of visibly diversifying away from American farmers, however uncomfortable that message might be, was smaller than the strategic cost of remaining dependent on a trading relationship that could be disrupted again with a single administration's next tariff announcement. There's a piece of this backstory that rarely makes it into trade coverage, but explains a great deal about how fast the Canadian side was able to move once the decision came. Canadian grain co-ops and provincial agriculture ministries, according to people who tracked these relationships over the preceding years, had spent that same period quietly investing in the certification standards Chinese buyers require: phytosanitary protocols, moisture content benchmarks, traceability documentation that historically only American exporters had fully built out at scale. That work had nothing to do with China specifically at the time it was done. It was framed internally as general export competitiveness. But it meant that when Chinese procurement officials came looking for a scalable alternative, Canadian soybean exporters were already certified, already compliant, already capable of shipping at the volumes required, without needing months of regulatory catch-up that would have given American negotiators time to respond. Let me walk you through how this actually came together, because the moment it became public looked sudden, but the machinery behind it had been running for a long time. Picture a procurement meeting inside a Chinese state grain trading company's Beijing offices in the weeks before the announcement. Long tables, procurement officers cross-referencing spreadsheets of global soybean supply against shipping schedules and currency projections, quietly finalizing purchase agreements that had been in negotiation for months. On one screen, according to people familiar with these planning sessions, a rolling map of global soybean sourcing, the volume shifting year by year, the American share shrinking incrementally on every version of that chart going back to 2018. On another, freight and port capacity projections for Vancouver, cross-referenced against harvest timing in the Canadian prairies, timed precisely to allow Canadian exporters to fill a purchasing window that had traditionally belonged almost entirely to American growers. In the final week before the filing went public, according to people familiar with the internal review, a small group of officials inside China's Commerce Ministry reportedly debated how much attention the announcement should be allowed to draw. Some argued for a formal ceremony, an official signing with Canadian counterparts that would maximize the diplomatic signal being sent. That option was ultimately rejected. The final decision, as it was later described by people briefed on the discussion, favored minimizing the appearance of confrontation entirely, framing the shift as routine commercial activity rather than a deliberate rebuke of American trade policy. The instruction passed down to the officials drafting the filing was reportedly simple: let the volume numbers do the talking, and give American commentators nothing quotable to build outrage around. That restraint, more than any single phrase in the eventual bulletin, is what left American trade officials with so little to push back against once the news broke. The agreement itself, once finalized, moved through customs and procurement channels with the same procedural flatness that has characterized nearly every major diversification move China has made in agricultural trade over the past several years. No summit, no handshake photo. A customs filing, a procurement bulletin distributed through trade channels before it reached general news coverage, arriving with almost bureaucratic indifference to the market reaction it was about to trigger. According to commodity traders who track these filings in real time, the first sign most American agricultural attaches had that anything had changed was the bulletin itself, not a diplomatic notification, not a courtesy call, just a document that quietly rewrote purchasing expectations for the season already underway. The silence in American farm country that followed the announcement carried its own weight. There was no dramatic diplomatic protest that changed the underlying facts, because by the time the filing became public, the purchase agreements were already signed, the shipping schedules already booked. The Canadian grain elevators already coordinating harvest logistics around fulfillment windows that used to belong to Iowa and Nebraska co-ops. What had functioned for 2 decades as an assumed, nearly permanent buyer relationship discovered, in the space of one procurement bulletin, that the relationship had already been quietly hedged against for years by the one customer American growers had never seriously imagined replacing them. The aftermath moved in every direction at once. Farm state senators from both parties issued statements within hours demanding an emergency review of agricultural trade policy, warning that sustained loss of Chinese demand could depress soybean prices across the entire Midwest for multiple growing seasons and threaten the viability of family farming operations already stretched thin by years of tariff-related volatility. Soybean futures dropped on the news before partially recovering as traders worked to model exactly how much of the American market share the Canadian deal would actually absorb versus how much represented longer-term diversification pressure that had already been baked into prices. Canadian officials, in public statements, framed the arrangement carefully as an opportunity for Canadian agricultural exporters rather than any deliberate targeting of American farmers, emphasizing that Canada had simply been ready to meet demand that existed. Almost nobody who understood the years of groundwork behind the deal believed that framing captured the full picture. Behind the public statements, according to people briefed on internal discussions inside American agricultural trade offices, the reaction was closer to genuine alarm than the calm public messaging suggested. For years, American trade officials had treated Chinese soybean demand as durable leverage in broader trade negotiations, a card that could always be played because China, surely, had no fast alternative source at meaningful scale. That assumption had already been eroding for years through the Brazilian diversification, and this Canadian arrangement made clear that the erosion had a second track running in parallel the entire time, one American negotiators had significantly underestimated. One agricultural trade official, speaking to industry press without attribution, acknowledged that the scale and readiness of the Canadian supply relationship had caught the department by surprise, and that officials had been negotiating recent trade disputes from a position of leverage that no longer existed at the scale they assumed. Warren Buffett's fuller analysis of the moment reframes it away from politics and toward something closer to a lesson in commodity market behavior that he has watched play out across 6 decades of investing. In his experience, Buffett has said, the businesses and countries that get blindsided by a customer's departure are almost never blindsided by the departure itself. They're blindsided by how long the preparation for that departure had been quietly underway before anyone noticed. Buffett's economic translation of the soybean shift is direct. A customer as large as China doesn't build an alternative supply relationship over a single season at a peak. It builds one over years, methodically, specifically so that the option exists the moment political circumstances make exercising it advantageous, and by the time that option gets exercised, it is not a negotiating tactic anymore. It is simply the new operating reality. Once Canadian and Brazilian supply chains are fully integrated into China's procurement rotation, Buffett has argued, American growers aren't negotiating to keep their old market share. They're negotiating for a smaller permanent slice of a market they used to dominate outright. The historical parallel Buffett draws on here is one he has returned to often in describing supplier relationships inside his own portfolio companies. He has described watching large customers quietly qualify a second supplier, not because they were dissatisfied with the first, but purely as insurance, and how that second relationship, once established and tested, tends to get used eventually, almost regardless of how the original relationship performs, simply because the option now exists and using it carries strategic value on its own. The universal principle he extracts applies with striking precision here. A customer who has spent years quietly building an alternative is not a customer who is bluffing, and treating that customer's diversification as temporary leverage rather than a completed structural shift is, in Buffett's words, the single most expensive misread in commodity trading. His verdict line on this episode is already circulated widely across agricultural trade press. This wasn't retaliation, Buffett has said. This was a hedge that finally matured. There's a second layer to Buffett's analysis worth sitting with. because it explains why he considers this shift more dangerous for American growers than the first trade war ever was. Buffett has pointed out, in conversations with associates who track agricultural commodities for his portfolio, that the first trade war produced a wound American farmers could see and organize around: tariffs, retaliation, direct government subsidy payments to offset the damage. This kind of quiet, multi-year diversification produces no equivalent alarm because it doesn't arrive as a single confrontational event. It arrives as a slow softening of demand that's easy to attribute to normal market cycles right up until the year it becomes clear the cycle isn't coming back. That, Buffett has said, is what makes structural diversification so much harder to fight politically than a tariff dispute. There's no single decision to reverse. There's just a customer, quietly, permanently buying somewhere else. Now let's talk about where the consequences of this actually travel, because they extend well past a single season's price dip. Economically, the most immediate exposure sits with American soybean growers across the Midwest, particularly smaller family operations with less capital cushion, who now face a structurally smaller buyer base for the crop that anchors their annual revenue. Agricultural lenders are already signaling closer scrutiny of loan applications tied to soybean-heavy operations, anticipating multiple years of price pressure. Politically, the deal hands ammunition to critics of the broader tariff strategy, who have long argued that aggressive trade pressure risks accelerating exactly the kind of diversification it was meant to prevent, forcing farm state officials who supported that strategy to explain a headline outcome that looks, to their own constituents, like a direct hit to their livelihoods. The political dimension in Washington runs deeper than a single news cycle, too. Farm state representatives who spent years defending an aggressive tariff posture as necessary leverage now face constituents asking a much simpler question, one without a comfortable answer. If the strategy was supposed to protect American agricultural interests, why did the country's largest agricultural customer spend those same years quietly building away around American growers entirely? That question doesn't resolve with a single policy adjustment, because the underlying diversification, once completed, doesn't reverse just because the political conversation in Washington shifts. It sits there, in signed contracts and certified port infrastructure, regardless of what gets said in the next election cycle. There is a strategic dimension here, too, one that rarely makes agricultural headlines but matters enormously to trade planners. Food security has long functioned, in both Washington and Beijing, as more than an economic category. It sits close to national security planning, because a country's confidence in its ability to reliably feed itself and its allies underpins broader geopolitical posture. China methodically diversifying its soybean supply away from the United States doesn't just cost American farmers revenue, it reduces the strategic leverage the United States has historically held as China's most reliable large-scale food supplier, a leverage that has quietly informed broader trade negotiations for years. Every country currently negotiating agricultural trade terms with the United States now has a concrete, recent example of what sustained tariff pressure produces on the other side of the table. And Brazilian and Canadian growers, the direct beneficiaries of this diversification, gain a permanent foothold in a market they spent years positioning to enter. The irreversibility of this shift deserves particular weight, because agricultural supply relationships, once established through certified logistics chains, port infrastructure investment, and multi-year purchase agreements, don't unwind the moment political relations improve. The Vancouver and Thunder Bay port upgrades built to handle this volume will keep handling it. The Canadian grain elevator networks retooled around Chinese buyer specifications will keep serving that market. Even in a scenario where American and Chinese trade relations fully normalize within the next several years, the physical and contractual architecture of this diversified supply chain will still be there, still absorbing a share of Chinese demand that used to belong to American growers by default. That is what separates a structural shift from a temporary disruption. And it is why farm economists are already advising growers to plan multi-year strategies around a smaller Chinese buyer base rather than waiting for a return to the old arrangement. There is an asymmetry worth naming plainly here, because it's the detail that keeps coming up in conversations with trade economists about this episode. Building an alternative buyer relationship at this scale takes years of unglamorous, uncelebrated groundwork, certification harmonization, port infrastructure investment, relationship building with grain handlers on the other side of an ocean. Losing an established one took none of that visible effort. It took a series of tariff decisions, each reasonable enough on its own terms. That accumulated into a signal no major buyer could responsibly ignore. That asymmetry, more than any single figure in this story, is what economists keep returning to. Trust built over 20 years can be eroded by a handful of years of inconsistency, and rebuilding it, if it's even possible, takes far longer than losing it did, and only starts once the underlying unpredictability that caused the erosion actually stops. There is a generational weight to this story that older farm families watching it unfold will feel more sharply than most. Many of the operations most exposed to this shift are multi-generational, land and equipment passed down through families who built their entire financial planning around the assumption that Chinese demand for American soybeans was as close to permanent as anything gets in agriculture. This restructuring doesn't happen through a single dramatic event, a bankruptcy notice, or a foreclosure announcement. It happens through years of slightly lower prices, slightly thinner margins, land values that stop appreciating the way they used to, decisions to not replant certain acreage, a long grinding recalibration that becomes undeniable only in hindsight, once an entire planting season has passed and the buyers simply never fully came back. So where does this leave things? Three numbers matter most in understanding what just happened. The scale of the new Canadian purchase agreements, now running into the billions of dollars annually according to trade analysts tracking the filings. The percentage of historical American market share that agricultural economists estimate is now structurally at risk over the coming decade, and the number of years, roughly 7, that separates the first trade war disruption in 2018 from this fully matured diversification becoming public. Those three numbers, the New Deal scale, the market share at risk, and the years of quiet groundwork behind it, tell the entire story of how the world's largest soybean relationship quietly came apart, not in a single dramatic rupture, but in a long accumulation of hedges built while one side assumed its customer had nowhere else to go. The philosophical verdict here isn't really about soybeans, or even about China. It's about what happens to any relationship built on the untested assumption that a customer, a partner, an ally has no alternative. That assumption feels safe for exactly as long as nobody tests it, and it stops being safe the moment the other side quietly decides to build one. China tested it patiently over years, and the answer it got back is now reshaping the economics of an entire American agricultural region before most of the farmers affected even understood the question had been asked. What happens over the next several planting seasons? As American growers and trade officials try to determine how much of this market share can realistically be recovered, will determine whether this becomes a painful but temporary correction or the permanent new architecture of global soybean trade. Either way, the era in which American farmers could assume Chinese demand as a fixed, dependable certainty is already over. What replaces it is still being negotiated in offices in Beijing and Ottawa, largely without American growers in the room.